from one of my favorite professors, Edward Glaser from Harvard University, a professor of economics there, says that cities are humanity's greatest invention. They're the place where we become more productive, where we become wealthier, where we become smarter. They become hubs for innovation. They become efficient. They're better for the environment because people can travel less. And in Asia, we've certainly seen that over the recent decade with this mass migration of people from regions into cities, Korea no less. And most countries, 70 to 80% of the populations of each country is based in a city. So cities are these really, really important things that actually are the center of our economy. So, how can we think about making those cities better? That's certainly the perspective that Uber comes at that problem with. What is Uber? Well, Uber's not as famous in Korea, but what we are is a technology company that connects drivers and riders through a smartphone application. It enables a new transport model so people can use existing vehicles that they have, private vehicles, to take people from point A to point P. And there's an opportunity for government to embrace these new technologies. We know that the average car sits idle 95% of the time. It's either in a car park at work or your parking spot at home. And we're trying to think about better ways to utilize those cars instead of people buying new cars. We are now in 600 cities across the world in 77 countries. When we think about the environmental cost, we can actually look at the scale of the problem. As you can see, the region has a major source of pollution from transport. In 2030, Asia's motorized transport emissions will be responsible for around a third of the global aggregate emissions. Asia suffers from the highest levels of air pollution in the world, as much as 80% attributable to transport. This is clearly a big problem. That's not the only cost. There's an economic cost. Getting stuck in traffic, we pay for it. We pay for it just with our time. 2 to 5% of gross domestic product every year is due to lost time in traffic and congestion. And there's obviously the human cost. Instead of spending time with our family, we're stuck in traffic jams on average 52 minutes a day. We spend, up to 26 minutes looking for parking. These are serious and significant problems, and we've worked with Boston Consulting Group to start measuring this around the region, and we actually found that Bangkok is the worst place for congestion and time wasted on traffic at the moment. And part of the problem is that there are over 1 billion cars in the world, and we don't need 1 billion cars in the world. The problem is not the car itself, the problem is how we're utilizing those cars. We're not here to demonize cars. What we are to say is that how we're using these cars, and does every single person need their own personal car? 55% of people in Asia consider ride-sharing services an alternative to car ownership. A lot of the time people look at Uber and they say, okay, well, they're here to disrupt the taxi industry. Well, actually, we see ourselves as disrupting the personal car use space. We actually think that what we're doing is trying to make someone decide to use a ride-sharing service rather than use their own personal car. About a quarter of Americans gave up their car last year, and 9% of that group turned to ride-sharing services such as Lyft or Uber to get around, according to a Reuters Ipsos opinion poll. If you have a child or a niece or a nephew under 10 years old today, what do you think the chances are of the first thing they'll do when they turn 18 will be to get a driving license? It's actually around 10% right now. One of the other interesting things that we're seeing in places that have adopted ride sharing is that because people are losing their cars, they're actually becoming more susceptible to using public transport. So instead of this idea that you use an Uber or get around a city, instead of using public transport, actually by giving up your car, you're using Uber for first last mile services. When I say first last mile, I mean getting to a station and from a station. And that's what Uber helps you do. Parking is obviously another one. The amount of space parking is taking in a limited limited area is huge. And we would need a parking lot of 25 times the size of Hong Kong to accommodate all of the cars just in Southeast Asia. So we've been working on campaigns in relation to how to educate people around what car use does and what we're turning our cities into by using cars and everyone wanting to own their own cars. And this is a bit of a video that we've released recently, which also has sound.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife. I mean the bare necessities are Mother Nature's recipes that bring the bare necessities of life. Wherever I wander, wherever I roam, I couldn't be found of my big home. The bees are buzzing in the tree to make some honey just for me. When you look under the rocks and plants and take a glance at the fancy ants, then maybe try a few. The bare necessities of life will come to you. They will come to you.
Ridiculous, isn't it, when we think about it from that perspective, what we're turning our cities into by spending so much time thinking about parking our cars, thinking about congestions, thinking about driving on our own. So we worked with BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, on a situation where we said, what if ride-sharing became the second most used transport in a city, i.e. public transport's number one, trains, buses, etc., and ride-sharing was the second most used form of transport, so take away personal car use. And we believe, from the numbers that we look at, we could reduce the number of vehicles on the road by the percentages that you see here. So even in Singapore, that regulates cars, they could take the same amount of trips, people could take the same amount of trips using 42% less cars than they do now. We did a similar exercise in places that use motorbike usage, Surabaya in Indonesia, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. So when you look at the actual number of trips versus the number of vehicles, this is how much you could actually reduce the vehicles on the road by if we were thinking about trips as shared trips rather than trips as being taken by individual cars. Now, what does that mean during peak congestion time? What we also looked at is, what is the speed of congestion during the time of peak congestion versus what it would normally take if there was no congestion? And in most cities, peak congestion means adding 70% more to the time, sometimes close to double. So if a trip would normally take half an hour in a non-peak period, it's going to take something like 45 minutes or 50 minutes during peak period. If we were sharing cars, we can reduce that congestion time quite significantly. And a lot of people say, well, how does this work in my city? Well, it works in different ways in different cities. The other thing we looked at is, okay, how does first world kind of cities, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, compare with Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries in the region? Well, it actually depends on what you're interested in, but obviously in high-functioning cities that are of higher income, Uber was used more for connecting people to public transport, whereas in lower income cities, it helped moderate other things in the cities, i.e. Not having people needing to purchase a vehicle. So there are different outcomes depending on the type of cities. One of the other points that we are keen to make is that ride-sharing is very, very different to taxi. So when we think about what ride-sharing does and what our application does, and this gets us to the AI point, it is a very, very different product. For taxis, you are manually hailing down a taxi on the street, or you're picking one up at a rank. or you're calling one up and booking something over the phone. With an application, there's a whole bunch of things that get sorted out that government used to kind of worry about in the past. So the application now will tell you the price. The application will now give the driver the direction. So it will work with a Google Maps type system to work out which is the fastest or quickest route to get to a particular place. It will match supply and demand. So right now we have a very kind of old system with taxis where if you're on one side of a building and the taxi's on the other side, the taxi driver doesn't know that you're actually only one block away. And the app looks after payments. So the payment goes directly from the rider to the driver without cash necessarily being used. So these are the kind of technology that we bring, and we believe that the regulations need to recognize the new technology. There's a misnomer that Uber doesn't want to be regulated. In fact, we want to be regulated, but not with regulations that were created in the 1950s or 1960s for taxis. Because in a way, we believe we've enhanced the service. So by having everything recorded digitally, there is a new safety standard now. People get into a vehicle and they know the name of the driver. They know the route that they're taking. It's GPS tracked. There's a digital record after the trip. If something happens during the trip, you're able to message your kind of loved one or friend your particular location. There's a feedback mechanism. So drivers are judged for every single trip. So drivers want to keep their rating up. So they're going to keep their cars clean. They're not going to smell. They're going to wash their cars. They're going to give you a good service because at the end of the trip, there is an opportunity for the rider to give a feedback on how the trip went. We also have 24-hour customer support and alert system that we work with law authorities on if there is an incident. So we believe we have increased the safety standards, and that is something that we believe needs to be recognised in the law. Now, we also believe that we can coexist with taxis. The chart on your right basically shows a supply-demand curve. A supply-demand curve is basically what is happening throughout the day. Very early in the morning, there is low demand, and then you get to kind of mid-morning and there's high demand as people go to work. Once people are at work, demand goes down, and in the afternoon when they're going home, demand goes up again. That is your basic day. Right now, we have a fixed supply of taxis dealing with that supply-demand curve, which means that during high demand or peak demand, there's not enough taxis. As we know, we're on the roads and we can't find a taxi when there's peak demand. And during the day, there's actually a whole bunch of taxis driving around the city empty. This is where we believe we can fit in. I think there's two stories here that I'd like to point out. One, taxis can be more efficient by working with applications like us because taxis will know when they need to be on the road and when they don't need to be on the road. And because we have a part-time driver base, most of our drivers are not full-time drivers, we can actually match the supply-demand during those peak hours. So there are many drivers that we have on our system that are happy to work 2-3 hours a day, drivers who are at university students on break, a lot of mothers who are looking for work that is flexible for a certain period of the day. So we believe this is what we can turn transportation into, not just by ourselves, but working with taxi as well. So at the end, I think what we're aiming for here is a safe, reliable service for riders, flexible opportunity for drivers, and fewer, fuller, and more efficient cars for cities. Now, we have done this in many places. Now, I've got to say, Korea is at a different stage in relation to its regulatory reform process when it's thinking about ride-sharing services. But here is a reaction from the Minister of Transport in Singapore. In peak hours, we have an inadequate supply of taxi drivers. Many of the community's interests are served because there is a supplementary group of drivers that come in the form of Uber and Grab, which is our competitor in Singapore. They are mostly part-time drivers. So these are kind of the reactions that we're seeing from governments that have adopted the new technology. The other thing that works for taxis is that we actually are making taxis more efficient in some of these markets that we're working with. We know utilisation rates of a taxi is around 30% at the moment. So less than 1/3 of the time is a taxi driver actually driving a passenger and earning an income. For Uber drivers, we see that at around 45 to 50% per hour. So if we're partnering with taxi, we can actually increase their utilisation by at least 50%. This is a map of Singapore. Singapore was the first city that we launched in Asia. What it's showing you is the concentration of Uber trips over time. Like taxi, we start very much in inner urban areas. However, over time, we spread out to more suburban areas. Now, I think this is the big difference, that at the end of the day, we see ourselves as growing the pie. We end up servicing communities where taxis don't tend to place themselves. A lot of these services are actually in areas that follow the train line. 30% of our trips in Singapore are to and from a train station. So that's people thinking, okay, I don't need my car anymore, I'm actually going to use the Uber to get to the train station and get to work. So it's complementing public transport. And over time, we see it here, we see it in New York, we see it in every city where the Uber services actually get out of the CBD. And what have governments done? Well, governments have had their own processes, and this is something that we hope to see soon in Korea. You know, they consult. The Australian government had a 3-month consultation process. Singapore and Malaysia reformed the entire industry by thinking about how to deregulate taxi at the same time as reforming the system to adopt ride-sharing regulations. Places like Vietnam have implemented interim rules in the form of a pilot just for app-based transportation companies like Uber. And what are governments thinking about? They're thinking about regulating their technology, which is us. They're thinking about the service that gets delivered, i.e. no price controls. They're thinking about who operates the service, i.e. the driver in the case of Malaysia. They're thinking about standards for drivers, i.e. making sure there's background checks, a licensing system, etc. And they're thinking about which type of vehicle should be used, i.e. can a private vehicle be used for these commercial type of transport? And all these problems that kind of come up in the debate have been solved by these countries in different ways. Another quote from the Singapore Transport Minister, but there's a few more quotes there. Commuters are in the best position to decide whether fares are set too high. The deregulation of fares serves to optimise the utilisation of resources. We are adopting a balanced, light-touch regulatory stance that protects the safety of passengers, yet ensures these technologies can flourish. And taking a look of a map in Asia, you can see that there are multiple different countries that have gone about regulatory reform in different ways to adopt this new technology and have it accepted in their country. And this is both in very first world countries like Australia to much more developing countries like India to countries that are in the middle of the road like Thailand and Malaysia. There is a regulatory process. Every city is different, every country is different, every state has their own issues, but at the end of the day, these countries have moved to create some kind of process to allow Uber to exist and ride sharing to exist. From the Malaysian Transport Minister on taxis, instead of seeing e-hailing companies or ride-sharing companies as the new taxi industry, I prefer to look at it in a way where both services can coexist. Each has its own goals. 59% of e-hailing application users have never used a taxi before. But where is all this leading when we think about the Industrial Revolution 4.0? I think in a way it's all leading to driverless cars, as was mentioned before. What we believe we're doing is creating social change for people to think about cars as shared vehicles. I think we will solve nothing from a congestion, from a traffic perspective, from a productivity perspective, if we replace one manual vehicle with one driverless car. What we want to do is actually ensure that when these driverless cars do come on the roads, that they are shared vehicles, that they are not individual vehicles causing the same problems as vehicles now, that need to be parked or that need to kind of sit in traffic lights, etc. We want these vehicles to be shared to ensure that we actually solve a whole bunch of other problems. So by creating the social change now, where people get used to sharing cars, will actually set countries up well for self-driving cars in the future. So I will end with a short video on our driverless car technology.
This is an Uber, but it's not driven by some guy trying to make extra money off his own car. This Uber drives itself. The ride-sharing giant came to Pittsburgh for its latest disruption, the country's first autonomous taxi service. Select Uber users can now ride in self-driving cars with trained engineers at the wheel, just in case. Of course, if they do their job right, they won't be needed forever. Here we go. Inside, riders are greeted by a tablet that shows them how the car works and how it sees the world. Uber plans to introduce a fleet of autonomous Volvo SUVs early next year, but it's using Ford Fusions for the time being. They can explore a 12-mile chunk of downtown Pittsburgh, an area the company's engineers quickly plan to expand. Over bridges, down narrow streets, around jaywalkers, the car handles just about everything, though the human engineer does have to grab the wheel every few minutes. The city of Bridges is happy to host a robo-revolution, with its promise of high-tech jobs and fewer crashes than ever before, even if some people find the jerry-rigged robo-rides perplexing.
It wasn't really steel, it was innovation that built Pittsburgh. Startups will choose places based upon the ability to be innovative. And there's never a time that regulations come before innovation. You can't stop the clock. And if you demand on stopping the clock, all you're assuring is that technology and those jobs will be in a different city.
Unlike California and other states, Pennsylvania hasn't restricted the testing of these cars, which means there's no rule against me climbing into the driver's seat. Okay, so it made that turn with no problem, little adjustment right there, but now we're heading over the bridge. And I've had drivers here worse than this. It's a pretty normal ride if you can ignore the radars, cameras, and laser scanners. You sit back and let someone else, or something else, take care of the driving. And no small talk required.
So driverless cars is now in 3 states in the US, and we hope to bring it to Korea soon. Thanks very much.